So on Tuesday it is St. Patrick's Day, yes. So I've been asked to think a little about St. Patrick, and Warren asked me to do that. So he was the patron saint of Ireland. So what do we know about St. Patrick? Well, I'm married to an Irishman, and in Ireland St. Patrick's is huge. The day, just to say the least, really. People have a day off work, which makes them rather jolly, and there's much drinking and much celebrating done. And throughout all different communities and towns, there's lots of processions. And I must admit, just a little quite funny, one year Tom and I were going through this little town, unbeknown to us, we got caught in this procession. So we spent about an hour just waving at people in our car, and people thought we were part of the St. Patrick's Day procession, which I thought was rather funny, but we couldn't get past because the sort of stream. So I was just saying to Tom, wave, even though with English number plates, but it's very amusing. So some other thoughts about him. Well, supposedly he rid Ireland of snakes. Don't know where that came from, but apparently there's no snakes in Ireland. And he established the Christian church in Ireland. And as I say, because the Irish community is so large, St. Patrick is known throughout the world as sort of the Irish moved, and in Australia, America, there's just a vast amount of Irish people. But I think, like so many things in life, we often know a little about someone, but it's only as we begin to look into someone's life do we begin to get a picture of what they were like, and we uncover surprises. And I certainly knew bits about St. Patrick, but I was very encouraged by his story. Apparently he was born in about 387 AD, and his name was Mywin Succat. So there you go. And he became known as Patrick when he became a priest bishop. He was part of a very well-to-do family, and he had a rather comfortable upbringing. And it's believed that his father was very involved in the church, was a deacon. But Patrick at the time was not a person of faith. And in his writings he said, "I did not know the true God." At the age of 16, he was captured by Irish pirates. He was taken to Ireland as a slave, and this began 6 years of hard labour. And he was sold to a local king, and he was put to work looking after sheep and pigs up in the isolated barren mountains. And I've been there myself with all my gear on, North Face and everything, and he would have had it really rough. And he spent 6 years up there, with very little prospect of ever seeing his family, his home again. He turned to the faith of his father, and in his writings he wrote this: "I used to stay out in the forests and on the mountain, and I would wake up before daylight to pray in the snow, in icy coldness, in rain, and in hunger and nakedness my life was not valued more highly than the animals I tended." After 6 years, he escaped by stowing away in a small boat and returned home to his family. And this sort of was a few hundred miles across the Irish Sea. This was a very small boat, so it was quite a dangerous journey. And on Thursday, we're going to Ireland, and I've just booked us on Irish ferries, which will have sort of fresh coffee and newspapers, and it'll be very nice. It certainly won't be a little rowing boat. So it was a very dangerous journey indeed. And one can only imagine what it must have been like when he walked back into his village, and his family and his friends and his community saw him. Because the person who had left, who had been kidnapped and taken to Ireland, was quite a carefree young man, but he returned very, very differently because of the pain and the awful memories of the experience that he had endured. However, on his return, he drew upon this experience of oppression, of injustice for good, and with a newfound faith in God, felt that God was calling him to be a priest. And he travelled to Gaul. I had to look that up because I didn't know where it was. It's Western Europe. And he studied for the priesthood for several years. Whilst he was there, he had a series of dreams in which he heard Irish voices saying to him, "We beseech thee to come and walk once more among us." Now, those around him were quite concerned by this, because Patrick was adamant he wanted to go to Ireland. They tried to talk him out of it. Not only was he vulnerable due to having been a slave there and escaped, but also being quite newly ordained, they just felt he didn't have the experience. However, he managed to talk them around, and in about 432 AD, he returned to Ireland. He returned to the place that he had once desperately tried to escape from, to live amongst the people and to live out his ministry with them and in the midst of them. Patrick then spent about 30 years wandering around Ireland as a bishop. And much of this time is wrapped in myth and legend, but there are some actual historical documents which document his achievements. And it's believed that within 10 years he's set up churches, monasteries throughout the country. He baptised thousands of people and ordained hundreds of priests. And I know around the corner from where Tom's mum lives in Naas, there's St Patrick's Well. And it's, sort of very much that, St Patrick literally baptised hundreds of people in this well. So whenever we go, Tom and I go to St Patrick's Well to look at the place. Whilst this all sounds wonderful, it was not without cost, for he longed to leave Ireland and to return home. And he wrote, "How I would have loved to go to my country and parents, and also to Gaul, in order to visit the monks and to see the face of the saints of my Lord. God knows it that I much desired it, but I am bound by the Spirit." He didn't leave Ireland, he chose to stay. Patrick was no stranger to oppression and injustice. He was a victim of it. And it was this that underpinned his desire, his willingness, and indeed courage to return to the place of this injustice and oppression. He did not return to seek revenge, but to share the love of Christ. Patrick listened to the voice of God, which he had heard through his dreams. He chose to leave all he knew, his home, family, security, in order to live and be among the people of Ireland. The very place that a few years earlier had been the place where he'd only experienced this injustice. Patrick changed the face of Ireland. He shared the gospel, he lived amongst the people, he travelled the length and breadth of the country, and he established religious communities and the church. But I feel that if we just leave it here, we'll be doing him a great disservice. It's believed that Patrick was one of the first people in history to speak out against slavery and also against the way women were treated, disregarded and marginalised. And in one of his writings he wrote, "It is the women kept in slavery and poverty who suffer the most. The Lord gives grace to them, and though they are forbidden, they follow Christ with backbone." It's very good. Patrick spoke out in difficult and dangerous times because he knew what it was like to suffer, to be treated as someone who had no value or worth placed upon their life. After much time and indeed struggle, his cries against slavery were extremely successful, and the slave trade in Ireland stopped. I think that if we're not careful, we can underestimate the achievements of Patrick, for he established the abolition of slavery in a time where allegiance to the king and lord and hierarchy was the norm as such within society. Patrick's changed something that was part of a culture and a fabric of society. He changed something that I think he would have struggled to believe possible when he was herding sheep upon the hills, alone and cold and scared, all those years ago as a slave. But change came. Patrick returned to the place who had oppressed him, to those who had held him captive, to those who had placed his value as nothing more than an animal. He returned in love, in the love of Christ. Patrick chose to live amongst them, but he knew that he could leave at any time. But he knew that God wanted him to stay in a place that was not easy, but extremely difficult. Patrick also knew that there were thousands of other people in Ireland that were suffering like he had, who were perceived as having no value or dignity, were victims of poverty and oppression, just like he had been. He chose to stay and to live the incarnational message of the gospel. I am thankful for the community here at St Bride's for Open Table, and many of you will be no strangers to oppression and injustice, especially by the church. But you have chosen to stay to live the incarnational message of the gospel within your lives, within the world of the church, to be a voice for the LGBT community within both the church and society. Being in or returning to the place that has oppressed or treated you extremely badly is not easy, and it can cause suffering and often means struggle. Patrick knew this, you know this, and Jesus knew this too. For like our reading tells us, Jesus had nowhere to lay his head, and Patrick didn't either as such. And the LGBT community continues to struggle to find a spiritual home too. But I believe that one of the mysteries of following Jesus is that we are called to enter into solidarity with those who suffer. And as we do so, this brings with it a sense of the divine. For when we are willing to enter the sacred world of shared suffering, we enter into the presence of the crucified Christ, the one who calls us to take up our cross, to follow him into the world, into the church. Only a fellow sufferer can understand suffering and struggle. So we can, I believe, take much from Patrick, for his life and story encourages us to continue in the struggle for equality for the LGBT community within the church by living in its world, among its people and structures, even if it is a place that is often difficult, intolerant and oppressive. Like the dream that Patrick had, which led him to return to Ireland, I believe there are many asking the same of the LGBT community too. We beseech thee to come and walk among us. This will not be easy. You have already experienced suffering and struggle, and I have struggled as a priest who supports and speaks out against the injustice I see and experience. However, as we continue on in our journey towards Good Friday, to stand beneath the cross, we know that our journey will lead us to an encounter with the suffering Christ. But let us be under no illusion about the suffering and struggle we will meet there. For at the cross we come face to face with the reality of a God who enters into suffering. And here we see love. A love that hears the cries of those who suffer and those who struggle. And a love that longs for justice too. Amen.